Okay, welcome to our first Friday speaking event. My name is Dwayne Wesley. I'm the chair of the CISC department. This speaking event is part of a series of speaking events that we have. It's the CISC department in association with Mesa Robotics Organization, MRO. The purpose of these speaking events is to promote science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And to that end, we're interested in all sorts of different speakers. So if you have any connections or ideas of speakers that you might be interested in having be a part of this, please let me know. Because I'm and don't assume that just because they're a star in some industry that you might not be able to get them. We've actually been able to get some fairly prestigious speakers. And all of our events have been very fascinating. Our first speaker was Hugo Award-winning science fiction author Werner Vinge. And so yeah, it's if you have any ideas, please let me know. Also, if you have any interest in robotics whatsoever, please feel free to come to Mesa Robotics. It's open to it's open to everybody. But we meet Fridays, noon to 2 in room K303. And so yeah, I highly recommend that if you have any interest in robotics at all, you should participate with us. We're actually going to have a short meeting after this event, so if you want to hang around after that, you're more than welcome. Today's speaking event started out with an email that I received from Craig Brown, who's one of my adjuncts, where he let me know that he had been offered the opportunity to be part of a scientific expedition, a deep sea scientific expedition to the Tonga Trench. But he wasn't sure if he'd be able to arrange it, and he'd probably have to miss a week of teaching here for us. And then he found out that, it's actually more involved than that, and that it would actually take 2 weeks. He'd have to be 2 weeks of not teaching, and so he knew that was just completely unreasonable, and so he refused the offer. And I responded to him by saying, "Are you crazy?" And I said, "No, you're going." So we made the necessary arrangements to make sure that he could take advantage of what is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And the only thing that he had to pay back, that he had to do was to make sure that he talked about his event, shared his experience with us. So anyway, he's definitely one of my brightest adjuncts, and he's an extremely talented individual. And I'm sure that this is going to be quite a fascinating speaking event. So please welcome Craig Brown.
Thanks, Dwayne. Yes, welcome everybody. It's great to be with you today. Dwayne mentioned that I had rescinded my request to take the trip. I didn't realize Tonga Trench is on the other side of the international date line, so the expedition itself was only 7 days, but you lose a day in travel and coming back, you get a day back, and it's much more involved to get there. You can't just fly straight to the Tonga Trench. So with the travel time involved, it actually took us 2 weeks to do the whole trip, but the scientific cruise was actually just 1 week. So today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what the trip was, what kind of research they were doing, tell you a little bit about the ship and the instruments that we used, and we'll talk about what we found so far. A lot of stuff still remains to be found with the samples that were taken, but there's some things that we know already based on what we collected. So just a little bit about the cruise itself. This was a cruise that was funded by a thing called the UC Ship Fund, and it was a student-led expedition. So what happens with these, the Scripps Institute of Oceanography operates a fleet of scientific vessels, and there's a lot of competition by different research institutions, government agencies, the Navy. They are all vying for time on these vessels to do research. But occasionally there's a gap in the schedule. So normally they'll go out for a couple months and they'll have a team from the government, NOAA or the Navy doing some research, and they'll be out there for an extended amount of time. And once in a while there's a week free in the schedule where they've got a gap between major expeditions. And so the UC Ship Fund was set up to give students an opportunity to propose research or make research proposals. And that gives them an opportunity to actually lead an expedition on their own. So they're shorter expeditions, but they're actually student-led. So our team was a pretty diverse group. It included PhD candidates, but it also had undergrad students and then faculty advisors. So our PhD candidate who led our expedition, her advisor was on the trip along with a couple others. We also had the National Geographic representative. We'll take a look at his instruments. They took a lot of photography. Unfortunately, I'm not able to share that. They hope to publish it. And then there were people like me. I was just a volunteer researcher. There were a team of us. And normally a scientific expedition would have extra hands on deck to do kind of the grunt work and the extra work that needs to be done to deploy instruments. But students don't have that kind of funding available. So that's where an opportunity to be a volunteer came in. So that's kind of how I got an opportunity to be on the cruise. So Tonga Trench, as Dwayne mentioned, is the second deepest point in the whole world. And it's located in the South Pacific. This graphic here shows the course that we took. We left from we left from Apia, Samoa. This is all kind of northeast of Australia in the South Pacific. So we started in Samoa, and we traveled south to the actual Tonga Trench. We stayed on station for 3 days, deployed a lot of instruments, which we'll talk about, and then we finally returned to Suva, and this was where the next expedition picked up. So you can't fly directly to Samoa from California, from the U.S. So we actually started off in Auckland, New Zealand. This is a picture of a sky tower that's in Auckland. So it's a pretty tall tower. We actually had dinner at the top of that tower. Here's a picture of the Auckland skyline. And you can see the tower sticking up there. Auckland, if you're not familiar, it's a city the same size as San Diego. It's a modern city. It's in New Zealand. It's just as big as San Diego. So to see a tower like this, it's a pretty tall tower. So if you're wondering why I'm showing you this picture, it's to give you a frame of reference for how deep the Tonga Trench actually is. So that sky tower is 328 meters tall. The Tonga Trench is over 10,000 meters. So it's 30 times as deep as that tower is tall. So we were out there for a lot of different purposes, scientifically speaking. The team that was there not only was diverse in their scientific experience, but also in their scientific interests. We had biologists, we had chemists, we also had physicists. So pretty wide range. The biology focused mainly on microbiology, and the physicists focused on sound. So here's a little bit about the Roger Revelle ship itself. That was the ship that we were on. Couple facts and figures. I think the most interesting thing was that you can't really drop an anchor at a depth like that. So this ship is equipped with GPS dynamic positioning, meaning the engines were running the whole time, and they pre-programmed a GPS coordinate, and the ship was able to maintain the position just by kind of directionally adjusting its thrust. It wasn't turning all the time. The thrusters actually could pivot 360 degrees and maintain the spot regardless of what the tide or the wind was doing. Another thing that became interesting as the cruise went on, wasn't really obvious going in, but the ship has a full-time crew, a captain and mates, engine folks, everybody that just operates the ship and keeps everything running smoothly. Those guys stay out there for months at a time, up to 6 months. The science crews rotate in and out, and there's kind of an interesting dynamic that goes on between the crew that have been out there and are out there, and then these science folks that come in for a few days at a time, especially in our case, we were there for a week. And of course, the science crew kind of sets the agenda, or what they think the agenda should be, and then the ship crew kind of brings them back to reality in some cases and kind of suggests things that may or may not work the way they thought they would. And I think particularly with a student-led trip, there wasn't, it was just interesting to see the experience of the ship's crew, even though they weren't scientists, kind of come into play as the cruise and the deployments unfolded. So here's a picture of the ship itself. And I'm a computer science guy, so I had to bring a picture of the computer lab. This is a pretty well self-contained computer network. It has its own storage array. It has about 100 terabytes of storage. It runs gigabit Ethernet, just very similar to what we would have in a corporate LAN environment. But it's very self-contained because the internet connection is very bad. So it's able to do its own backups. It's all pretty well self-contained. Obviously, it has a lot of instruments that are tailored to scientific research. There's several different kinds of depth finders, position finders. It's kind of hard to see these, but certainly a lot of equipment tailored to the science. But at the core of it, it's a LAN network that you would find a lot. There's a lot in common with just standard LAN technology. So this is the first instrument that we deployed. It's called the CDT. These cylinders around here are water sampling tanks. So there are something like 24 of them all the way around. And they start off open, so the cap and the cap on the top and on the bottom start off open. So as it's dropped down, the water just kind of flows through it. And then they pre-program a certain time for a particular numbered tank to snap shut. So they can let it go down to a certain depth and snap a couple tanks shut. And that basically grabs a snapshot of the water at that particular position. And so they, deploy it. This guy went down on a tether, meaning it was attached to the crane the whole time. And so they would just release it, let it go down several hundred meters. They'd stop. They'd close a couple tanks. There's other instruments that measure salinity or salt content of the water and the temperature. So they'd capture some readings, and then they'd go down further. And so they try to get a picture of what was happening in the whole water column, all the way from the surface or from some initial depth all the way down to the bottom. So there's a picture of him being deployed as he starts to sink down. I don't know how well you can see the color, but the water at a high depth like this is a deep, deep emerald blue. It was really beautiful. It was almost purple, how deep a blue it was. And so part of our job as volunteer researchers was to help with these deployments and retrievals. So this is actually a picture of my wife trying to get a hook onto this CDT so that when the boom brings it back overboard, it doesn't run into the ship or something like that. So we attach these lines to it. And that was kind of a challenge because this thing, when it's full, is about 1,000 pounds. She's considerably less than that. So once she got that line on there, it gave her a pretty good pull. But everything worked out. Everybody was okay. Eventually, we get a lot of lines on it, and then we're able to hoist the boom back over and drop it down. So the next instrument was what's called a Mcclain Pump, and this is basically a water pump that has filters in it. And it's fairly similar to the CDT in that it's deployed on a tether, so it was just hoisted down on a crane basically, and they would stop it at certain depths and they would pump huge volumes of water. So they would pump thousands and thousands of liters of water, and the need to do that is because they're studying isotopes. This is more of a chemical analysis. They're studying isotopes and they're looking for rare isotopes. And so in order to measure the frequency or the abundance of some rare isotopes, they need to do high volume pumping, or they need to look at a lot of water to get a good indication of how often these rare isotopes occur. So here's a picture of the thing being prepped. Now these guys do not have any data connection to this ship. They were all pre-programmed. So everything that they did was set ahead of time, and it was basically on a timer. So they had to pre-program these guys. That's what they're doing here. These are a couple of the scientists, and this is one of the other volunteers. And so I think this is coming back now. We're bringing it back in. And on the last deployment, we put this little bag on there, which is kind of funny. So these are styrofoam cups. These started off as 8-ounce styrofoam cups that you might drink coffee out of. But when you put them in a bag and you drop them down to, I think it was 500 meters of depth, the pressure compresses them. So everybody drew a picture on their cup, and then they put them on here. And this was like the last deployment. So everybody was kind of tired at this point and getting a little punchy. So scientists actually like to have fun while they're out there too, and sometimes need a break from being in the lab and processing samples. So this was one of the kind of fun things that we did while we were out there. So the next instrument was the deep sound. So this is the sound recording device. Now this one was different because it did not have a tether on it. So this one we literally dropped off the side of the ship, and it has these weights on the bottom of it, and it just sank. It was not connected in any way. There was no data or physical connection to the ship. So it basically, again, was pre-programmed to drop these weights after a predefined amount of time. They had to calculate that based on the mass and the weight of the object, how long it would take to, and the depth of the water. So they estimated how long it would take to reach the bottom. This one wasn't such a critical calculation because they actually wanted it to stay at the bottom for about 9 hours. So they set those weights to be dropped, several hours after it was deployed. And it basically listened to the sounds going on. I'm sorry. This is a picture of me helping to deploy it. So we did all kinds of work on the ship. They put us, we basically just asked how we could help. We didn't have any predefined role going into the cruise. They didn't really tell us what to expect or what our job would be. So we basically just pitched in wherever needed. And whether it was attaching a line to the ship like my wife was doing there, or just helping to lift these things into position to put them on the crane, we were doing those kind of tasks. So here he is going down. This is right before we release the hook on him. And so we deployed two of these, two separate devices, pretty similar. But the second one we had a lot of trouble finding. So these things drop they just drop freely, and then they come back, they drop the weights off, and then they start to float. And so the tide and the current of the ocean can move them around quite a bit. So it's our job, once they come back up, they have a radio signal on them, and once we pick that up, it gives us a directional signal that we can follow to go find the device. Well, unfortunately, we were in the middle of the ocean on a huge metal ship, and that causes interference. So on the second device, we had a lot of trouble getting the signal. So it took well into the night before we were able to locate it, and it actually was spotted rather than, we never got the signal, the radio signal. We had somebody on the top of the bridge with binoculars that literally saw it off the side of the ship. And so we finally got to it, and we had all kinds of trouble getting it on board. We didn't steer the ship all the way to it because we were concerned about running it over. So we kind of got out ahead of the path of the current and let it come to us. Well, it hit near the back of the ship. So I was literally near the bottom of this picture. Oops, sorry. I was near the bottom of this picture with one of those staffs sticking on it, trying to hold it off, and I was just pulling on it, trying to keep it from going underneath the ship. Finally, we got it, and we got the hoist on it. But it was quite an adventure. It was a little scary for a while. More scared that we were going to lose the device than any kind of danger and stuff. But it was pretty exciting. Finally, when we found it, this is the scientist. He was very happy. He was really relieved. The ship's crew was unhappy with us that we weren't able to get the signal. It took so long to find it. It blew the schedule out of the water and kind of caused some. It was pretty dramatic. But we finally did get it back, and he's still recording, or he's still analyzing that data today. So we don't have any immediate results from that data collection. That scientist's name is Dave. He's still doing analysis on that sound that he recorded. But what he's trying to do is establish what baseline sound is in the ocean. So if there's nothing else going on, what do you hear? So just what the ambient sound sounds like. And with that, he hopes to be able to do things like enhance the analysis and surveillance. The Navy listens to the ocean all the time. If you have a good understanding of what the baseline sound is, you can kind of subtract that out and focus in on interesting things without that interference there. Another thing that he would like to do is deploy a lot of these instruments, or this is kind of a prototype, but he'd like to make a production version of it and possibly deploy thousands of them all over the world at a static depth of, he said, maybe 100 meters or something like that. And he feels like you can monitor weather conditions at the surface by listening from underwater. And by having the thing maintained underwater, it's not subject to the actual weather. So it doesn't get battered and beaten by the sun and the wind and all the tide and all that kind of stuff. So it would be more stable down there. But it could give us a lot of data at a higher resolution of data than we're able to get with existing weather monitoring technologies. So those are kind of things he's hoping to do in the future. Right now he's just working to establish this kind of baseline. The next device we called the lander, and this was kind of a combined device. So this is where the National Geographic camera is on the top, and then there's additional water tanks, sort of similar to the ones that we had on the CDT on the bottom. And it's all kind of tied together on basically just a metal I-beam with a float to make it come back up. So here's a picture of the drop cam itself. So that's the National Geographic camera. So the computer components in here are fairly standard components. They use a lot of laptop parts, both in this device and in the Deep Sound. All of the computer controls are not exotic computer equipment. That was surprising to me. I thought we would find a lot of robotics and really, state-of-the-art gear. It was actually really quite the contrary. Maybe because this was a student-led trip and they don't have the kind of budget that a NOAA or a naval expedition would have. But these guys used the most standard parts they could find because they were cheap and they could be replaced easily. So they ran Windows operating system, Windows embedded operating system. They used laptop parts as much as possible. This one had strobes in it, so that was a little bit specialized. These lights are inside this dome, which maintains pressure, but then they reflect off the mirrors. You can see that. Here's a couple more pictures of it. Here's his logo. And here we see it actually being deployed. So we did a nighttime deployment on this, which was kind of fun. The lights made it look like something out of a science fiction movie. But you can see, the lights on, hit the mirrors, and provide light for the camera to take pictures. You can see these guys are in the open position, so they're ready to take a sample when they reach the bottom. And this is another free-floating one again. So this one just drops down to the bottom, and after a predetermined amount of time, in this case, both the tanks would snap shut, and then the weights would be released, and then it would float back to the top. This guy did not have weights. They didn't bring weights with them when they brought this. The National Geographic rep said that it would have cost him about $1,500 to ship the amount of weight that he needed. On an airplane, like they limit the number of bags you can carry, and they charge you an arm and a leg to carry any extra bags. It would have cost him about $1,500 to have checked the amount of weight he needed in order to sink this thing. So they literally found like old pieces of metal that were scrap on the ship, and they used that as the anchor weight. So these guys were doing calculations on the fly to measure the weight and the mass of the metal that they found, add that into the device that they already had, and then calculate how long to wait before they released that weight. So they had to estimate how fast it would sink, how far it was going to go, how deep the bottom was, and then that would give them the amount of time. So it's basically an algebra problem, right? Rate times time and distance. But that was something they had to do on, the day of the deployment, based on what they found on the ship. Had a little more trouble getting this one back. This guy traveled pretty far, so the current took it far away from our position. So we actually deployed a Zodiac to go tow it back. And so this is a picture of bringing it back after they found it, towed it, and got it alongside the ship. And we still had to do the same process of attaching a hook to it and getting the crane on it, finally hoisting it back in. So we took the lander out a total of 3 times. So we dropped it down 1 time, then it came back. Unfortunately, the water tanks had leaked. So we sent it down a 2nd time and took more water samples. Finally, the 3rd time we deployed it, baited. So instead of having those tanks be empty at the beginning, they actually put chicken in them. And the idea was to try to attract animal life. So crustaceans or any other kind of life that we could find at that depth. Of course, I thought we were going to get a giant squid or something. But unfortunately, the 3rd time, it did not come back. So even after the first deployment, there were signs of stress fractures on the drop cam. The second time it was a little worse, and so we assumed that the third time it imploded under the pressure, which of course killed the computer, and it probably never dropped the weights. But when I wrote in the blog, we said that the giant squid got it. And again, the water samples taken are actually, all the water samples taken are actually still on board the Roger Revelle ship. It's returning to San Diego, just kind of by chance, but it's returning to San Diego for the first time in about 7 years. But again, the students don't have budget to do shipping for things like water samples, so the ship's crew agreed to keep the samples stored, knowing that they were coming back to San Diego in November. So they haven't even started analysis on these water samples yet. They will, as soon as the ship comes in, they'll get them, and they're very excited to start studying the samples that they took. But so far, they haven't even started that. And the video taken by National Geographic, my understanding is that you did not get a lot of great footage, so not likely that it'll be on a documentary or anything. The big hope was that this third deployment would show some life form that hasn't been recorded before. Unfortunately, we never got that footage back. It's it was something that was recorded on a hard drive. There was no data connection to get live. We didn't get a stream from the device, so we don't have any idea what was recorded. So I'm sticking with the giant squid story. So another device was a sediment core. So this was a long PVC pipe with a huge weight at the top. This is just a big stack of weights. Sorry, this picture's a little bit dark. But the idea is just this was tethered, and it was dropped all the way to the floor. And the idea was just to take a sample of the sediment, the ocean floor. This was one of the deepest core samples ever taken. Not the absolute deepest, but probably in the top 10 deepest samples. This is a picture of us bringing it back. So there was quite a bit of uncertainty about when to start hoisting it back in. So we released this whole thing, or deployed the whole thing on a tether. And we have a depth gauge, but we're operating kind of at the upper end of the equipment's design. So it's telling us that we're at 9,800 meters. We're not really, the depth is reading at 10,000. We're not quite sure when we hit it, and you can't really be sure because you don't get. It's not like dropping something into a fish tank or something where you feel the slack when you first hit the bottom. I mean, there's 10 kilometers of slack to let out before you feel any feedback. So we really weren't sure whether we had reached bottom or not. We thought we might have been on the bottom for 100 meters before we started to pull it back up. So we were both concerned that we had nothing, we hadn't even reached bottom, or that we had so much coiled line on the bottom that it might come up like tangled or with knots. So the last 1,000 meters on the way back up, we were watching the crane come up the entire time, just to make sure that no knot came up from the water that would have jammed the crane. We would have had to stop. Didn't turn out that way. Everything worked out fine. It was quite a production to bring the thing back on board. This is about a 12-foot long pipe. And so we hoisted it over the side. This is a picture of a guy on a ladder. I don't know how dark that is for you, but this is a guy on a ladder with a handful of volunteers holding both the core and the ladder, trying to get it unhooked from the crane. Finally, we got it attached to the side of the ship. We were able to start processing the samples. So these are a group of the students, and we were overjoyed at how much sediment we got. So we were unsure whether we got any at all. It turned out that this 12-foot pipe was more than halfway full of sediment. So it was about 2 meters worth of sediment. So quite possibly tens of thousands of years worth of sediment. So this is a group of the scientists. Knowing how much sediment they had, they were overjoyed and jubilant. They started painting their faces with it. You can see some on Lahini's back here. They were overjoyed. It was almost like a scene from Mission Control when they land the space shuttle or something. They were overjoyed. One scientist, Janan, she actually tasted the sediment. I was really hesitant. I might have watched too many movies, But I was concerned about some exotic virus or something because this was sediment from undiscovered. I mean, there had never been a sediment sample taken from this particular spot, and so I didn't know what was in there. And yeah, probably too many movies as a kid. But as far as I know, everybody's fine. In fact, I do know everybody's fine. So everything worked out. Here's a picture of what the sediment actually looks like. It was a lot like, I don't know, chocolate mousse or chocolate pudding or something like that. It was very, very wet, obviously, very fine. And so what we did was we sliced that PVC in sections for the first meter or so. I think we did just 3 centimeter samples. So we just sliced it into really little kind of cakes. And we recorded that depth and took those into test tube samples, and then near the last portion we kind of took bigger parts. We weren't prepared for the amount of sediment that we had. It yielded more than we expected, so we were scrambling to have enough test tubes and bags labeled so that we could actually even just collect everything, much less process it. But one of the younger graduate students may actually spend his entire graduate degree studying this sediment. There was that much of it there. It'll depend a little bit on what's found in there. We didn't observe any visible life. There were no animals floating around in it or fossils or anything like that. But when we washed it and filtered it and looked at it under a microscope, what we did find was really diverse rock formations for different types of rock. So from a geological point of view, it was a fairly interesting find. We didn't have a geologist on the ship, but the other scientists were excited to be able to share this with them. Hopefully they find some. They're still studying the sediment for microbial life. We couldn't see that off the bat, and really all of the molecular or the microscopic analysis is yet to be done, or is either in progress or still to be done. So we just deployed the core the one time. Again, we got over 2 meters of sediment. And there was a lot of different types of rock in there. So one of the last instruments that we deployed is just a plankton net. This is just a simple net. Doesn't go down to the bottom of the ocean, but we were interested in seeing what was going on out there in plankton. This is really just a pretty straightforward net that we engage the ship, so the ship starts moving and we tow the plankton net behind. At the back of the net is this sort of PVC device that's acts like a sieve and filters out the plankton. And we got a really good collection of plankton on this tow. So these were things that we actually were able to process on the ship. So this is one of the volunteers, and then this is one of the faculty advisors, Greg Rouse. He's one of the leading worm scientists in the world, I guess. His focus is on marine worm species. So we helped to do this. This is a difficult thing to do. So basically, we took a sample of the plankton that was collected in that PVC. We washed it, put it in a petri dish, and then tried to sort it with a pipette under the microscope, which is challenging enough because these are live plankton. So once you touch them with a pipette, they try to get away. So it's hard enough to catch them, but then you add on a little extra difficulty because you're doing this in a microscope on a moving ship. So you kind of get some tunnel vision, a little bit of vertigo. You can see this patch on his ear. This is motion sickness medication. So it wasn't that easy to focus on in a microscope on moving objects while the ship was also moving underfoot. But we finally did, and we were able to capture several samples. So this is we brought a few examples of the plankton. I'm not a biologist, so I actually don't know what species these all are, but I thought they were pretty interesting species. Here's a few things. The scientists were really happy with the amount of plankton that we found and the diversity of species that we were looking at. Whoops, I think I skipped one. So I think these are really very pretty, and these are all under a microscope, so these are very small, but really very beautiful. I see a lot of bioluminescence in ocean, especially in deep ocean species, but even not, this was at 100 meters, so it's really not that deep. And then this guy, my guess is that James Cameron saw this guy when he made the movie The Abyss.
Really?
It really looks like that might have been the inspiration. So the plankton net was kind of fun because we really got to be part of the science. It wasn't just deploying the instruments and kind of the physical work involved, but we actually got to do a little bit of work in the lab and see some immediate results. You know, a lot of science work involves lots of hours in the lab. You don't really get that immediate finding. It usually takes a lot of time. So both before and after the cruise, some of the science team went scuba diving. There's a lot of avid divers. You can imagine folks from Scripps Institute Oceanography are big fans of the ocean, and so they're avid scuba divers. So I wanted to share a few pictures that they brought back. So here's some coral from Fiji. And Fiji has some of the most vibrant coral in the world. Fortunately, I'm not certified to scuba dive, so I wasn't on this part of the trip. So there actually was a kind of interesting find here. This is called a crown of thorns. It's a variety of starfish. Unfortunately, what makes it special is that it eats coral. And not only does it eat coral, but it eats coral voraciously. And so you can see all this white colored coral that it's sitting on has been eaten and is now dead. And unfortunately, particularly on the Samoa dive, they found lots and lots of these crown of thorns, and they devastate coral, which is a really big concern, particularly because with increasing carbon in the atmosphere and in the ocean, that makes the ocean water more acidic, so that's harder on the coral also. So coral is kind of getting hit from two different fronts now. The water is becoming more acidic, making it harder for it to live, and these crown of thorns are becoming very invasive, and I don't know that they have a natural predator to keep them in check, but they're doing a lot of damage to coral reefs, particularly the Great Reef in Australia, and also apparently in Samoa. So this was actually, and here's another picture of a crown of thorns. They're really pretty, but it's tragic that they do so much damage. Yeah, he said there were hundreds of them down there. It was pretty scary. The good news is that he took a lot of pictures. This is Greg. He took a lot of pictures of the damage that they were doing. Kind of felt like the photography was somewhat, not that it's a new phenomenon or a new discovery, but he was able to document it, kind of catch them red-handed and document the damage that was being done. So we're hopeful that that'll help to make a case. I don't know that there's anything man can do to reverse that, but at least with the knowledge of what's going on, that gives us a place to start. Because I mean, these coral reefs. This is Fiji. And it's just incredible how abundant the life is and how beautiful it is. So, certainly something worth trying to save. A few more. So as we saw, the Fiji's incredibly vibrant coral. The crown of thorns is a big threat, and we really hope that this happens. I believe the plan is to publish a paper about this and use the photographs that were taken to demonstrate what's going on out there. So that was all the deployments. And again, most of the most of the research is yet to be done. We were out there collecting samples, and those need to be brought into a lab and studied further before we really have any findings. But in general, what I found, being a volunteer on the ship, was, and I mentioned, the dynamics between the ship crew and the science crew was really fun to watch. As I was kind of an observer in that. I didn't have a real interest or any kind of say in whether we deployed something during the day or at night. But the student who was leading, the lead scientist, had a very thought out schedule when we got on the ship. She thought she knew exactly what time we were going to deploy each instrument and when it was going to come back. And that just wasn't how it worked. The crew raised some concerns and we had to adjust. So we ended up working almost 20 hours straight once we reached station. When we deployed those first 4 instruments in series, and then they started coming back at different intervals. And so it was about 20 hours straight of either deploying something or retrieving something, including that second deep sound guy that was such a headache. It was a lot of physical work. And I also found it really interesting how common the instruments were that they were using. Again, I expected to find very state-of-the-art equipment. I thought, it would be great to come speak at MRO because I would have seen some robotics and I could have talked about the state-of-the-art robots that they're using. But that just wasn't the case. We were using standard parts. The core sample was a PVC pipe that I've seen at Home Depot. It did have a nose cone on it that was made specially, but the core itself was PVC. The weights looked like weights from any weight bench. So they really tried to use common parts. And really, the fun part of the trip was the students' enthusiasm. It was really infectious to be around some kids that were just so passionate about the work that they're doing, so interested in science and where their research might lead. Particularly, the microbiologists didn't have any immediate findings, but they're really just on the cusp of discovering a life cycle or a circle of life that's happening at the microscopic level that's really separate from, but complementary to, the kind of food chain that we're used to talking about in science classes. So we talk about predators and prey species and how they all work together in this big food web. Well, they're discovering now, and they're just learning about this entire other cycle that's happening at the microscopic level, which basically runs underneath the macro level animal food web that we're used to talking about. And so a lot of these microbiologists' research is trying to understand that, both at a biological level and at a chemical level. And so I really don't know that much about it, but it's really just interesting to hear them talk about it, and it's just there's so many things out there to learn about still. It's really encouraging to see students like this that are finding new things. They're contributing to really the knowledge of man as a whole through a lot of hard work. I mean, they go out and this trip didn't go quite as expected. There were a lot of successes, and we got 9 out of 10 of the instruments that we deployed came back, but one didn't. Things didn't always go the way we planned. There were some surprises along the way, but all that'll come together and helps to contribute really to the knowledge of man as a species. I mean, the sediment that we sampled will go into a library or a collection that Scripps maintains that goes back to scientific samples that have been taken for 50 years. And they maintain this library, this collection, for future researchers to have samples to look at and to study. So it's contributing to things that will maintain or will persist for many years to come. So for you guys, if you're students, if you have any interest in problem solving, if you're curious about how things work and you like to investigate things, figure out why things happen or how they work, if you like to build things or solve problems, there's a ton of work out there for scientists and technologists, engineers, mathematicians. So if you are interested in those kind of things, really can't encourage you enough to look at a career in science. If you think you might be interested, talk to me afterwards. And if you're interested in Scripps, we could arrange. They need volunteers there. There's actually a shortage of scientists and engineers in the world, but there's also a shortage of people to help them, hoist instruments over the side of the ship or process samples and chase plankton in a petri dish. So if you think it might be something you're interested in, I invite you to talk to me, and we can arrange, either a tour or get you set up as a volunteer, because there really is a lot of work to be done out there, and there's a shortage in the job marketplace. There's a shortage of engineers now. So if that's a degree you're interested in pursuing, your prospects are really, really positive. So with that, I'll open up to questions. There's a little bit more information if you're interested. I'll leave those up there. Or if you'd like to give me your email address, or I can give you mine and we can send this out. But do we have any questions?
Let's see, the trench, basically, was it caused by the sections of the earth moving with respect
Yes.
to each other? I forget the name of the apply those.
Yeah, so the trench is caused by two tectonic plates, one's shifting under another. That's called a subduction zone. So there's the Tonga plate and the Pacific plate, I believe. And that's where they intersect, and one plate is going under the other. And that's what causes the trench.
So one plate is higher, one plate is lower.
Mm-hmm.
So the trench basically has one higher component, one lower component, kind of thing?
Well, I guess the trench is kind of the intersection of the two. So the one side of the trench is one plate, and the other side is the other.
And one's higher, one's lower?
Yeah, one is folding under the other. So I guess one is kind of at an angle,
Yeah.
going down, and it's moving quickly from geological point of view. It's moving like 24 centimeters per year. Yeah, I mean this is almost a continuous earthquake. It's such an active area of tectonic movement. And 24 centimeters a year, that's quite a bit of movement. It's part of the Ring of Fire too, so it's very, very active.
You talked about measuring the sound,
Mm-hmm.
basic sound that exists. Is any of that to do with respect to the place moving with respect to each other?
I'm sure that it's something that was recorded. It wasn't mentioned as an area that he was interested in researching. His current focus is just that ambient sound, just measuring a baseline. But the sound was recorded all the way down, so it didn't just record at the bottom. He was trying to get a recording of the entire water column.
You said they're looking for volunteers. Do you have to be affiliated with UCSD to volunteer, or?
Nope. Yeah. Yeah. I'm an alumni, but I was not. I'm not employed or otherwise associated. If you're interested, I'll talk to you afterwards.
Yeah, so you just volunteered. Is that how you became affiliated with them? You just volunteered?
Yeah.
It's like computer science, but what was either the most fun or the most memorable time not on the ship, but on the trip?
Sure. Well, I mean, the whole trip was, honestly, it was an experience of a lifetime. The whole thing was exciting. I mean, not only were we on this cruise, but we had to travel, we traveled to New Zealand, we traveled to Samoa and Fiji. So the whole thing was really kind of a whirlwind. I was pinching myself the whole time, honestly. In terms of the cruise itself, I think getting the sediment core back and discovering how much sediment we had actually collected and the excitement that was generated when we, basically the tech, dropped a bolt on a string down into the top to see how deep the sediment was, how far the water went down and where the sediment started. And he barely got it in there, and it was very early on in the string letting out, and it went slack when it hit and just everybody erupted and cheered, and it was really exciting. That was probably the highlight of the scientific part. Any questions?
The photographs that you had of the mineral specimens, those came from the core sample?
Yes.
Those were through a microscope, or how small were those?
That was through a microscope. It was so that the first picture of the kind of chocolate mousse looking stuff, we washed that and then ran it through filters. I'm trying to think of how many. They have nanometer filters that are graded. and I don't remember how many nanometers that particular sample was, but it was under a microscope. I don't know exactly what the magnification was. They were very small, yeah. About that, yeah, probably about that order of magnitude, about a grain of sand. The sediment was very fine to touch. It was smooth. There weren't rocks in it by any chance, or even pebbles. It was very smooth. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Dwayne. I'd like to thank Dwayne and Jill for being so supportive of the trip. He wasn't kidding about me rescinding my request and then him telling me no, I absolutely have to go. I wish my day job boss was as supportive, but obviously he did agree. But it really was a great opportunity, a very exciting trip, and the science is just amazing what's going on in the scientific community today. So, really encourage everybody to take a look and explore it as an opportunity. Thanks very much.
Greg. That was awesome. So, yeah, there's a lot of great material in there. A couple things I've come to really appreciate is that the utility of PVC tubes. And the other is that no matter how prepared you are, if you're involved in something of this nature, that you can expect to have to improvise. So appreciation for that's a good ability for all of us to try to develop, be able to improvise as necessary. So anyway, thank you all for coming. I want to make sure the faculty knows this is the flex number. Make sure you sign here. Students that want extra credit, make sure you got your name here and signed up. And if anybody wants to stay after this, we're going to have a short little MRO meeting too. So anyway, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.